In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Maple Ridge, life moved at a gentle pace. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode their bikes down the sidewalks, neighbors waved hello from across hedges, and weekends were spent mowing lawns or hosting small backyard barbecues. For David Harper, this suburban haven seemed like the perfect place to raise his family after years of serving in the military. He had left behind the chaos and danger of war zones, trading it for the calm predictability of civilian life. But little did he know that even in such a peaceful setting, trouble could find its way. David, a former Army Ranger with sharp instincts and a disciplined demeanor, had always been a man of action. His career in the military had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations, make quick decisions, and protect those around him. Now, as a husband and father, his focus had shifted entirely to creating a safe and happy home for his wife, Emily, and their 2 young children, Lily, who was 8, and Jake, who was 5. They had moved into the house on Maple Lane 2 years ago, drawn by the promise of good schools, friendly neighbors, and a tight-knit community. At first glance, everything seemed ideal, but beneath the surface of this idyllic suburb lay a web of unspoken tensions. The Homeowners Association, HOA, responsible for maintaining the neighborhood's pristine appearance, enforced strict rules about nearly every aspect of daily life. From lawn care schedules to noise restrictions, the HOA expected residents to adhere to an almost obsessive level of orderliness. Most people complied without complaint, seeing these regulations as minor inconveniences necessary for keeping property values up. However, not everyone shared this perspective. One particular neighbor stood out among the rest, Gregory Hensley. A retired accountant in his late 60s, Gregory was known for his gruff demeanor and short temper. To some, he came across as merely eccentric, a man set in his ways who didn't tolerate nonsense. To others, however, he was a constant source of irritation. Gregory took immense pride in his meticulously manicured yard and believed everyone else should do the same. If someone's grass grew too long, if a car was parked too close to the curb, or if a party ran past 9 p.m., Gregory would be the first to notice and complain. At first, David tried to brush off Gregory's complaints. When notes slipped under, the door criticized the length of his hedge or the placement of his trash bins, David simply shrugged them off. "He's just trying to keep things nice," Emily would say, ever the peacemaker. But over time, Gregory's grievances became harder to ignore. He began showing up unannounced at the Harpers' front door, lecturing David about minor infractions with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Each encounter left David feeling increasingly frustrated, though he managed to keep his cool for the sake of his family. What made matters worse was Gregory's inability to let anything go. Once, when David accidentally backed his truck onto the sidewalk while parallel parking, Gregory stormed over within minutes, red-faced and shouting about reckless behavior. Another time, when Lily accidentally kicked a soccer ball into Gregory's flower bed, he demanded compensation for the damage caused by the stray toy. These incidents, trivial as they may have seemed to most people, only fueled Gregory's growing animosity toward the Harper household. Despite his frustrations, David remained determined to avoid conflict. Having seen real violence during his time in the military, he understood the importance of choosing battles wisely. Besides, he reasoned, Gregory was just an old man with nothing better to do than nitpick. Surely, there was no need to escalate things further, so David continued going about his life, doing his best to stay out of Gregory's crosshairs while focusing on what mattered most, providing for his family and ensuring they felt secure. Yet deep down, David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was an unsettling edge to Gregory's behavior, an unpredictability that hinted at deeper issues beneath the surface. Whether it stemmed from loneliness, bitterness, or something else entirely, David couldn't say. What he did know was that living next to someone so volatile required vigilance, and so as the days turned into weeks, David found himself constantly scanning for signs of trouble, preparing mentally for whatever might come next. Little did he realize, however, that the worst was yet to unfold. In a twist, no one could have anticipated, the simmering tension between David and Gregory would boil over into a confrontation unlike anything Maple Ridge had ever seen. It would test David's resolve, push his family to the brink, and force him to draw upon skills he hadn't used since his days in uniform. The quiet suburb of Maple Ridge was about to become the stage for a drama that would leave its mark on everyone involved and change the Harper family forever. It was a warm summer evening, the kind where the air felt thick and sticky, and the sky glowed orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Harper family had decided to host a small barbecue in their backyard, a rare chance for David, Emily, and the kids to relax together after a busy week. Laughter filled the air as Lily chased Jake around the yard, while Emily flipped burgers on the grill. David leaned back in a patio chair, sipping lemonade and enjoying the moment of calm. For once, life seemed perfect. The music playing softly from a portable speaker added to the cheerful atmosphere. It wasn't loud, just enough to create a pleasant ambiance, but it carried faintly over the fence into the neighboring yards. David didn't think much of it. After all, they were inside their own property and the volume was low enough that it barely reached the street. But what felt like harmless background noise to the Harpers would soon become the spark that ignited a firestorm. Across the fence, Gregory Hensley sat on his porch, stewing in irritation. He had been watching the Harpers gathering with growing displeasure. To him, their laughter and music were invasive, disrupting the quiet solitude he cherished. Gregory prided himself on maintaining order in his little corner of Maple Ridge, and anything that deviated from his rigid expectations set him on edge. As the sound of chatter drifted closer to his ears, his jaw tightened and his fists clenched. Finally, unable to contain his frustration any longer, Gregory stood up abruptly and marched toward the fence separating his yard from the Harpers. His footsteps were heavy, each one echoing his mounting anger. When he reached the boundary, he called out sharply, his voice cutting through the peaceful evening like a knife. "Hey, do you mind keeping it down? Some of us are trying to enjoy our homes without all this racket." David turned at the sound of Gregory's voice, his relaxed posture stiffening slightly. He recognized the tone immediately. It was the same one Gregory used whenever he wanted to assert dominance or make a point. Setting his drink aside, David walked over to the fence, determined to address the complaint diplomatically. "Evening, Gregory," he said calmly, offering a polite smile. "Sorry if we're bothering you, we'll keep it down." But Gregory wasn't satisfied. Instead of accepting David's apology, he launched into a tirade, his voice rising with every word. "You people never listen. Every time I ask nicely, you ignore me. This neighborhood has rules for a reason, you know." His face reddened, veins popping on his forehead as he gestured wildly. "I've had enough of your disregard for decency and respect." By now, the argument had drawn the attention of the rest of the family. Emily paused mid-flip on the grill, her brow furrowing in concern. Lily and Jake stopped their game of tag, sensing the tension in the air. David raised his hands slightly, palms open in a gesture meant to de-escalate. "Gregory, let's not do this right now," he said evenly. "We're just having a quiet evening with the kids, no harm intended." "No harm," Gregory spat, his eyes narrowing. "You think blasting music and making noise late at night is no harm? You're selfish, that's what you are." His words dripped with venom, and his body language became increasingly aggressive. He took a step closer to the fence, leaning forward as though ready to climb over. David's instincts kicked in. Years of military training had taught him how to read body language and assess threats, and something about Gregory's demeanor set off alarm bells. Still, he kept his voice steady, refusing to let the situation spiral further. "All right, Gregory, we'll turn the music off completely. Is that okay?" For a brief moment, it seemed like Gregory might relent. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his expression softened, but only for a second. Then, without warning, he spun around and stormed back toward his house, muttering under his breath. David exhaled slowly, hoping the confrontation was over. He motioned for Emily to shut off the music and return to his seat, trying to reassure the kids that everything was fine. But just as the family began to settle back into their evening, the screen door of Gregory's house slammed shut. He reappeared moments later holding something in his hand that made David's blood run cold. A handgun. Marching back to the fence, Gregory pointed the weapon directly at the Harpers, his face contorted with rage. "You want to disrespect me? Fine. Let's see how far you're willing to push this," he shouted, his voice trembling with fury. Time seemed to freeze. Emily gasped, instinctively pulling Lily and Jake behind her. The children froze, wide-eyed and terrified, unsure of what was happening. David's heart pounded in his chest, but instead of panic, his mind shifted into high gear. Every lesson he'd learned during his time in the military rushed to the forefront: how to stay calm under pressure, how to assess a threat, and most importantly, how to protect those he loved. Standing tall, David positioned himself squarely between Gregory and his family, shielding them with his body. His voice remained firm but measured as he addressed Gregory. "Put the gun down, Gregory. This isn't the way to handle things." Each word was deliberate, designed to pierce through Gregory's anger and force him to focus. Gregory hesitated, his grip on the weapon tightening. For a split second, it looked like he might lower the gun, or worse, pull the trigger. The tension hung heavy in the air, suffocating and unbearable. Neighbors who had been going about their evenings began to notice the commotion, peering out of windows or stepping onto porches to see what was happening. A few brave souls ventured closer, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Meanwhile, Emily quietly slipped her phone from her pocket, dialing 911 with shaking hands. She whispered urgently into the receiver, describing the scene while keeping her voice low so as not to provoke Gregory further. David didn't need to look to know she was calling for help. He trusted her implicitly and focused entirely on diffusing the situation. "Gregory," David continued, his tone unwavering, "we're neighbors. We can work this out. Just put the gun down and we'll talk." He locked eyes with Gregory, searching for any sign of rationality beneath the haze of anger. It was a gamble, but David knew that breaking through to someone in crisis required patience and persistence. And right now, the safety of his family depended on it. As the seconds ticked by, the standoff stretched on, each moment feeling like an eternity. The music may have stopped, but the chaos it had unleashed was far from over. What started as a minor disagreement had spiraled into a life-threatening situation, leaving the Harper family and the entire neighborhood on edge. For David, there was no room for error. One wrong move could mean disaster. David's mind raced as he stood rooted in place, his body acting as a human shield between Gregory and his family. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, to disarm Gregory, to protect Emily and the kids. But years of military training had drilled one crucial lesson into him. Hasty actions in volatile situations often make things worse. Instead, he focused on maintaining control, both of himself and the escalating confrontation unfolding before him. Gregory's grip on the handgun remained firm, his knuckles white as he pointed it toward David. The weapon wavered slightly, betraying the older man's unsteadiness, but the threat was undeniable. His chest heaved with each labored breath, and his eyes darted wildly, searching for something, perhaps validation, or maybe just an outlet for the rage consuming him. David recognized the signs of someone spiraling out of control. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was desperation fueled by frustration and isolation. "Gregory," David said again, his voice calm yet commanding, "you don't want to do this. Think about what you're doing right now." He spoke slowly, deliberately choosing his words to avoid provoking further hostility. Years of leading soldiers in high-stakes scenarios had taught him the power of language, not just what was said, but how it was delivered. Tone mattered more than anything else in moments like these. Too aggressive, and Gregory might lash out. Too passive, and he could lose whatever fragile connection he'd managed to establish. Behind David, Emily clutched the children tightly, her free hand still gripping the phone as she whispered updates to the 911 operator. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to stay composed for the kids' sake. Lily buried her face in her mother's side while Jake stared at Gregory wide-eyed, tears streaming down his cheeks. David couldn't turn around to comfort them, but he silently willed strength into their hearts. "Stay strong," he thought. "We'll get through this." Gregory's response came in a growl, low and guttural. "Don't tell me what I want," he barked, taking another step closer to the fence. The gun shook in his hand, its barrel wavering. Dangerously. "You think you can ignore me? Treat me like dirt? Well, here I am, Harper, look at me." David didn't flinch. Instead, he locked eyes with Gregory, holding his gaze steadily. It was a tactic he'd used countless times during negotiations in hostile environments, making eye contact to create a sense of accountability, forcing the other person to see him as a human being rather than an abstract enemy. "I'm looking at you, Gregory," David replied evenly. "And I hear you. You feel disrespected and that hurts. I get it." For a fraction of a second, Gregory's expression softened. There was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the armor of fury he'd built around himself. But, almost immediately, the hardness returned and he tightened his grip on the gun. "Stop pretending you care," he snapped. "You never cared about anyone but yourself." David exhaled slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "That's not true, Gregory," he countered. "I live here too. My family lives here. We're part of this neighborhood, just like you. And we're trying to be good neighbors. But tonight, this isn't the answer." The word tonight seemed to resonate with Gregory. His shoulders sagged slightly and his breathing grew heavier. For a moment it looked like he might lower the gun. But then, as if snapping, out of a trance he straightened up again, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to David. "Nobody understands." David seized the opening. "Then help me understand, Gregory," he urged, his tone softening further. "Tell me what's really bothering you. Is it the noise? The rules? Or is there something else going on?" It was a risky move. Asking questions in such a charged situation could backfire, giving Gregory an opportunity to vent even more anger. But David knew that people in crisis often craved acknowledgement, that they wanted someone to listen, even if only for a moment. And judging by the exhaustion etched into Gregory's face, he was carrying burdens far heavier than neighborhood disputes. Sure enough, Gregory hesitated. His eyes darted away from David's, scanning the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered, at a safe distance. Some stood frozen in shock while others whispered urgently among themselves. A few held up phones recording the scene. The attention appeared to unsettle Gregory and he shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at David. "You wouldn't get it," Gregory finally muttered, his voice quieter now, tinged with bitterness. "None of you ever do." "We won't know, unless you tell us," David pressed gently. He took a cautious step forward, ensuring his movements were slow and predictable. "Whatever it is, Gregory, we can figure it out together. Just put the gun down and let's talk." Gregory's arm trembled as he held the weapon aloft. For a fleeting moment it seemed like he might comply. Then, suddenly, his resolve crumbled and he shouted, "No, you don't deserve to talk. You've been ignoring me for months. Months." The volume of his voice startled everyone, including David. But instead of reacting defensively, David doubled down on his approach. "I'm sorry if it felt that way, Gregory," he said sincerely. "I truly am. If we messed up, if we hurt your feelings, I apologize. That's not what neighbors are supposed to do. But pointing a gun at my family, it's not the solution. Please, let's find another way." Gregory's lip quivered, and for the first time, David saw tears welling in the older man's eyes. Whatever demons Gregory was battling, they were eating him alive. David felt a pang of sympathy despite the danger. This wasn't just about noise complaints or HOA rules. This was about pain, loneliness, and a lifetime of pent-up frustration spilling over in the worst possible way. As the standoff continued, Sarah, a retired schoolteacher who lived next door to Gregory, cautiously approached the scene. She had known Gregory for years, long before the Harpers moved into the neighborhood, and she understood his quirks better than most. Her presence seemed to have a calming effect on him, as though her familiarity reminded him of a time when life felt simpler. "Greg," Sarah called softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Please, sweetheart, put the gun down. Let's sort this out without anyone getting hurt. Gregory blinked rapidly, his focus shifting between Sarah and David. For a moment, it looked like he might listen. Then, abruptly, he swung the gun back toward David, hissing, "Stay out of this, Sarah. This is between me and him." Sarah raised her hands placatingly, taking a careful step backward. "Okay, Greg, okay," she soothed. "Just breathe. Nobody wants anyone to get hurt." David seized the opportunity to reestablish his connection with Gregory. "She's right, Gregory," he said firmly. "Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. Not you, not me, not our families. Let's end this peacefully." By now, distant sirens could be heard wailing in the background, growing louder with each passing second. Emily had managed to convey the severity of the situation to the 911 operator, and law enforcement was en route. The sound of approaching police cars seemed to jolt Gregory back to reality, and his grip on the gun faltered slightly. David noticed the change immediately. "Help is coming, Gregory," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's make sure this ends the right way. Lower the gun and we'll work it out together." For a long, agonizing moment, Gregory stood frozen, torn between surrender and defiance. Finally, with a shuddering exhale, he lowered the weapon slightly, his arm dropping to his side. It wasn't a full capitulation, but it was progress, a sign that reason was beginning to seep through the haze of anger. David allowed himself a small internal sigh of relief. The immediate threat had lessened, but the situation was far from resolved. As blue and red lights flashed in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement, David remained vigilant, his protective stance unwavering. Whatever happened, next he knew one thing for certain: his family would come first no matter what. As the wailing of police sirens grew louder, the atmosphere in Maple Ridge shifted dramatically. The once quiet neighborhood now felt like a scene from a movie, with flashing red and blue lights illuminating the darkening sky. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the standoff began whispering nervously among themselves, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Some clutched their phones tightly, recording every detail, while others simply stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. It was clear that no one had ever expected their peaceful community to erupt into such chaos. Gregory's grip on the handgun loosened slightly as the sound of approaching squad cars filled the air. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing labored and uneven. For a moment he glanced toward the street where the first patrol car screeched to a halt, its headlights cutting through the dusk. Officers spilled out quickly, shouting commands as they assessed the situation. David remained, perfectly still, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender, ensuring the police understood he posed no threat. Behind him, Emily held Lily and Jake close, shielding them not only from Gregory but also from the sudden influx of strangers flooding their yard. Sarah, the retired schoolteacher who lived next door to Gregory, continued her cautious approach. She had always been known for her calm demeanor and ability to diffuse tense situations, qualities that served her well during decades of teaching unruly students. Sensing that Gregory's resolve was wavering, she took another step closer, speaking softly yet firmly. "Greg," she said, her tone gentle but insistent, "it's time to let this go. You've made your point. Now it's time to put the gun down." Gregory's eyes flickered between Sarah and the advancing officers. He seemed torn, caught between his anger and the realization that he was vastly outnumbered. The presence of law enforcement appeared to have an immediate effect, forcing him to confront the gravity of his actions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered the weapon further, though he didn't release it entirely. His knuckles were white, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle as if reluctant to let go. David seized the opportunity to reinforce Sarah's plea. Keeping his voice steady and measured, he addressed Gregory directly. "You're doing the right thing, Greg," he said, choosing his words carefully. "This doesn't have to end badly. Just hand the gun over to the officers and we can move forward from here." There was no judgment in his tone, only reassurance, a reminder that even in this moment of crisis, there was still a chance for redemption. The police officers moved cautiously, forming a semicircle around Gregory while maintaining a safe distance. One of them, a tall man with a commanding presence, stepped forward, his voice loud and authoritative. "Sir, drop the weapon immediately," he ordered, his hand resting on the holster of his service pistol. "Do it now!" Gregory flinched. At the command, his body stiffening defensively. For a split second it seemed like he might resist, raising the gun again in defiance. But then, as if overwhelmed by the weight of the situation, he hesitated. His gaze darted back to Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, her expression soft but firm. "It's okay, Greg," she murmured. "Just do what they say." With visible effort, Gregory finally relented. His shoulders slumped in defeat as he slowly bent down and placed the handgun on the ground. He straightened up again, his hands raised high above his head, palms open to show he was unarmed. The tension in the air eased slightly, though the scene remained charged with unease. Officers closed in swiftly, securing the weapon and cuffing Gregory's wrists behind his back. As they led him away, he muttered under his breath, his words barely audible, "I just wanted respect." The crowd of neighbors watched silently as Gregory was escorted to a waiting patrol car. Some looked on with pity, others with anger, but all shared a sense of disbelief. How had things escalated so quickly? What had driven a seemingly ordinary man to such extremes? These questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered for now. Once Gregory was safely in custody, the officers turned their attention to the Harper family. One of them approached David, introducing himself as Officer Ramirez. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his tone professional but empathetic. "Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" David nodded, taking a deep breath before recounting the events. He described how the evening had started peacefully, how Gregory's complaints had escalated into threats, and ultimately, how the situation had spiraled out of control. Throughout his explanation, he remained composed, his military training evident in his ability to stay focused under pressure. When he finished, Officer Ramirez thanked him and assured him that the department would handle the investigation thoroughly. Meanwhile, Emily ushered the children inside, desperate to shield them from the commotion outside. Though Lily and Jake had witnessed the worst of the confrontation, they were too young to fully grasp its implications. Still, the trauma of seeing a gun pointed at their father and feeling the fear radiating from their mother would undoubtedly leave scars. Emily resolved to seek counseling for the entire family, knowing they would need support to process what had happened. Back in the yard, the remaining officers worked methodically, documenting evidence and interviewing witnesses. Neighbors lingered, awkwardly, some offering quiet words of support to David while others expressed outrage at Gregory's behavior. Among them was Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had lived in Maple Ridge for decades. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Never thought I'd see the day when something like this happened here. It's just unbelievable." As the initial shock began to wear off, reality set in for everyone involved. The Harpers' once idyllic neighborhood now felt tainted, its sense of safety shattered. For David, the experience was particularly jarring. Having spent years in the military, he was accustomed to facing danger, but always within the context of combat zones, far removed from home. To encounter such a threat in his own backyard, surrounded by people he considered neighbors, was surreal and deeply unsettling. Despite the lingering anxiety, David couldn't help but feel a measure of relief. Thanks to his quick thinking and the bravery of those around him, the situation had ended without violence. He knew it could have gone very differently. One wrong move, one misstep, and the outcome might have been catastrophic. That knowledge weighed heavily on him, a stark reminder of how fragile life truly was. As the officers packed up their equipment and dispersed, the neighborhood gradually returned to silence. The flashing lights faded, replaced by the soft glow of porch lamps and distant stars twinkling overhead. Yet the calm felt uneasy, as though the night's events had left an indelible mark on the community. Conversations among neighbors were subdued, punctuated by nervous laughter and awkward pauses. Everyone knew that things would never be quite the same again. Later that evening, after the authorities had left and the crowd had dispersed, David sat alone on the front porch, staring out at the empty street. Emily joined him after tucking the kids into bed, settling beside him with a weary sigh. Neither spoke for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Do you think we should stay here?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. David hesitated before answering. Leaving Maple Ridge would mean starting over somewhere new, a daunting prospect, especially after everything they had endured. But staying meant confronting the memories of that night and rebuilding trust in a community shaken to its core. After a long pause, he replied, "We'll figure it out together. Whatever happens, we stick together as a family. That's what matters most." Emily nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. Together, they sat in silence, drawing strength from each other as the world around them slowly drifted back to sleep. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, they faced it with resilience, determined to protect their loved ones and reclaim the peace they had fought so hard to preserve. The days following the incident were a blur of activity and emotion for the Harper family. Life in Maple Ridge, once predictable and peaceful, had been upended by the events of that fateful evening. Neighbors who had previously exchanged pleasantries now approached David and Emily with a mix of curiosity and concern. Some offered heartfelt apologies on behalf of Gregory, while others expressed outrage at his actions. The community was divided. Some saw him as a troubled man pushed to his breaking point, while others viewed him as a dangerous individual whose behavior could not be excused. For David, the aftermath brought a whirlwind of legal obligations. He was called to testify against Gregory during court proceedings, tasked with recounting the harrowing details of the night when a gun had been pointed at his family. Preparing for this responsibility weighed heavily on him. Though he had faced many daunting challenges in his military career, testifying about such a personal and traumatic event felt different. This wasn't just another mission, it was deeply tied to his identity as a husband and father. When the day of the trial arrived, David dressed in his best suit, feeling both nervous and resolute. As he walked into the courtroom, he noticed familiar faces scattered among the spectators, neighbors from Maple Ridge who had come to witness the outcome. There was an air of anticipation in the room, underscored by hushed whispers and uneasy glances. Sitting beside Emily, who held his hand tightly, David reminded himself why he was there: to ensure justice was served and to protect his family from ever facing such danger again. Gregory appeared in court wearing a rumpled suit, his demeanor far removed from the aggressive figure David had encountered that night. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, he looked smaller somehow, frail and defeated. His attorney argued that Gregory's actions stemmed from untreated mental health issues exacerbated by loneliness and frustration. While some neighbors nodded sympathetically at this explanation, others remained unconvinced. To them, Gregory's behavior was inexcusable, regardless of any underlying struggles. David took the stand with quiet confidence, his years of discipline evident in his composure. When asked to describe the events leading up to the confrontation, he spoke clearly and concisely, painting a vivid picture of how Gregory's complaints had escalated over time. He recounted the verbal tirades, the unrelenting hostility, and, finally, the moment when Gregory had crossed the line by brandishing a weapon. Each word carried weight, not just because of its truth but because of the emotions behind it. "I understood that Gregory was upset," David explained, his voice steady despite the memories flooding back. "But nothing excuses pointing a loaded gun at someone's family. My children were standing right there, they saw everything. That's something no one should have to experience." His testimony struck a chord with those in attendance. Even the judge seemed moved, nodding thoughtfully, as David spoke. When questioned by Gregory's lawyer, David remained calm, deflecting attempts to shift blame or downplay the severity of the situation. By the time he stepped down from the stand, there was a palpable sense that his words had made an impact. In the end, the jury deliberated for several hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty on multiple counts, including brandishing a firearm and making terroristic threats. Gregory was sentenced to several years in prison, along with mandatory counseling and anger management classes. For David and Emily, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though it couldn't erase the trauma they had endured. They left the courthouse holding hands, grateful for the outcome but acutely aware of the scars left behind. Back home, life slowly began to return to normal, or as close to normal as possible under the circumstances. Neighbors continued to check in on the Harpers, bringing casseroles and offering kind words, yet beneath the surface tensions lingered. Conversations often tiptoed around the topic of Gregory, with people unsure whether to condemn his actions outright or show compassion for his struggles. Sarah, the retired schoolteacher, became a vocal advocate for addressing mental health within the community, organizing workshops and support groups aimed at fostering understanding and preventing similar incidents. Despite these efforts, David found himself struggling to let go of the anger that simmered inside him. Though he had successfully navigated the crisis, using his military training to keep his family safe, the emotional toll of the experience refused to fade. Nightmares plagued his sleep, replaying moments from that evening in vivid detail. During the day, he found himself constantly scanning his surroundings, hyper-aware of potential threats. It was as if his mind refused to switch off, stuck in a state of high alert even though the immediate danger had passed. Emily noticed the change in him immediately. Where once David had exuded confidence and calm, he now seemed restless and preoccupied. She encouraged him to seek professional help, reminding him that seeking therapy didn't make him weak. It simply meant he cared enough to heal. At first, David resisted, reluctant to admit that he needed support. But after weeks of sleepless nights and growing irritability, he finally agreed to meet with a counselor. Therapy proved transformative. In sessions, David unpacked not only the trauma of that night but also the broader anxieties that had taken root since leaving the military. Talking through his experiences allowed him to process the emotions he had buried deep inside. Over time, he learned coping mechanisms to manage his heightened awareness and strategies to reconnect with the present moment. Most importantly, he realized that acknowledging his vulnerabilities was a strength, not a weakness. As David worked on healing himself, Emily focused on rebuilding trust within the neighborhood. Together, they decided to stay in Maple Ridge, a choice rooted in defiance rather than resignation. Leaving would mean letting fear dictate their lives, something neither of them was willing to accept. Instead, they committed to becoming active participants in shaping the future of their community. One of their first steps was joining forces with proactive neighbors to advocate for changes within the HOA. They proposed implementing stricter policies regarding conflict resolution, suggesting mediation programs to address disputes before they spiraled out of control. Their initiative gained traction quickly, with many residents eager to prevent similar incidents. Slowly but surely, Maple Ridge began to transform, not just in policy, but in spirit. Community gatherings became more frequent, providing opportunities for neighbors to connect on a deeper level. Block parties replaced formal meetings, fostering camaraderie rather than rigidity. Families shared meals, stories, and laughter, rediscovering the bonds that made Maple Ridge special in the first place. Even those who had initially hesitated to engage warmed up to the idea of coming together as a unified front. Through it all, David and Emily remained steadfast in their commitment to protecting their family. They installed additional security measures around the house, including motion-activated lights and cameras, ensuring they felt safer without isolating themselves from the world. They also prioritized teaching Lily and Jake basic safety skills, empowering them to handle unexpected situations with confidence. These lessons weren't meant to instill fear, but rather to equip the children with tools to navigate life's challenges. Reflecting on everything they had endured, David couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. The ordeal had tested them in ways they never anticipated, forcing them to confront their fears and vulnerabilities head-on. Yet it had also strengthened their resolve, reinforcing the importance of resilience and unity. Maple Ridge might never fully return to the innocence it once embodied, but that didn't mean it couldn't evolve into something stronger, a place where compassion outweighed conflict, and where neighbors truly looked out for one another. Autumn leaves began to fall, blanketing the streets in shades of gold and crimson. The Harper family found solace in the rhythms of everyday life. The shadows of that summer evening still lingered, reminders of what had transpired and how close they had come to tragedy. But alongside those shadows stood moments of joy, connection, and hope. For David and Emily, these moments were proof that even in the face of adversity, love and determination could light the way forward.